So the reading is Psalm 30, and that's on page 461. And the title of this psalm is Joy Comes with the Morning. And it's the Psalm of David. Okay. I will extol you, O Lord, for you have drawn me up and have not let my foes rejoice over me. O Lord my God, I cried to you for help, and you have healed me. O Lord, you have brought up my soul from Sheol. You restored me to life from among those who go down to the pit. Sing praises to the Lord, O you, his saints, and give thanks to his holy name. For his anger is but for a moment, and his favor is for a lifetime. Weeping may tarry for the night, but joy comes with the morning. As for me, I said in my prosperity, I shall never be moved. By your favor, O Lord, you made my mountain stand strong. You hid your face, I was dismayed. To you, O Lord, I cry, and to the Lord I plead for mercy. What profit is there in my death if I go down to the pit? Will the dust praise you? Will it tell of your faithfulness? Hear, O Lord, and be merciful to me. O Lord, be my help. You have turned for me my morning dancing. You have loosed my sackcloth and clothed me with gladness, that my joy may sing your praise and not be silent. O Lord my God, I will give thanks to you forever. Amen.
Hey everyone, it's good to see you. I was just taking a quick drink to clear my throat, and I spilled water on my stomach, so it looks silly, but you have to just sort of excuse that. Okay. I don't know if it's just me, but it feels like every new TV program is a true crime drama. Like we're seeing this, like it's just everywhere, like true crime after true crime after true crime. I was reading a review of a new true crime drama on the BBC called The Sixth Commandment. I haven't actually watched it, but I was reading the review. And this is how the review starts. It starts, you may think that you are beyond being harrowed at this point, that age, experience, and daily headlines testifying to the relentlessly awful nature of the world have created a callus on your soul that protects you from such profound disturbance. I haven't watched it, so I don't know if that's true. But I was struck by how the review describes life in the West in the 21st century. It's heavy. People living with a callus on the soul. It's like a layer of insulation of cynicism that protects our heart from being exposed to further pain and suffering. I think a variety of factors have led us to this point, including but definitely not limited to increased work hours and burnout, economic inequality, the erosion of community living, lack of trust in politics, public services being stretched to breaking point, the surge in mental health illness, particularly amongst young people, and the ability of the world to maintain any sort of lasting peace. We live in a time that is marked by cynicism. The message of this psalm is, it's like an arrow that points in the opposite direction. My point today is very simple, that celebration is biblical. That's my point. Some of you maybe perhaps aren't sure if that's true. Maybe you've grown up in an expression of Christianity where faith is a solemn thing, serious, solemn, but not joyful, not celebratory. Perhaps your experience of church in the past is one where the belief in fallenness, which is a part of the biblical story, exceeds belief in redemption. If so, probably that might not be true to you. Or perhaps you're not a Christian, and maybe you've met Christians and your experience of them doesn't seem anything like what's said here. Maybe you've read about Christians, Doesn't seem like that's true with lots of Christians that we read about. Perhaps you don't believe this. If you're not a Christian, by the way, it's really great that you're here. You're really welcome. But I would guess that most of us, when you hear that statement, celebration is biblical, are probably like, yeah, that kind of seems true. That probably is true. But perhaps, like me, you might admit that often there's a disconnect between what you believe and how you live your life. Perhaps, like me, you might say, oh yeah, I believe that celebration is biblical, but maybe you wouldn't necessarily say that your life reflects that in the extent to which it could do. And the longer title of today's talk is Celebration is Biblical, and therefore we should celebrate. That's where I'm headed. Celebration is biblical, and therefore we should celebrate. Celebration is biblical. It's there on the first page of the Bible when God declares that what he's made is very good. It's there on the last page too. We'll come to that a little bit later on. And it's there in this psalm too. The context of Psalm 30 is somewhat unknown. At the start, if you see at the start, it says, it's the Psalm of David, a song at the dedication of the temple. Somewhat confusingly, David wasn't at the dedication of the temple. That happened under Solomon, his son, after David had died. So it probably wasn't actually written for the dedication of the temple. So scholars are a little bit confused about when it was written for. Some scholars think it was written for the dedication of a different building, a palace, a house of some sort. That's a possibility. Other scholars think that it was written when David brought the Ark of the Covenant back to Jerusalem, and he established it in the tabernacle, which was a big tent, which was basically a precursor to the temple. So some scholars think it was written for that moment. But the context is somewhat unclear. However, I would say that the message of the psalm is clear. If you remember when we looked at Numbers, one of the things that we looked at through that book was the fact that often ancient texts are written in a style called a chiasm. Do you remember that word, chiasm? That's what's going on here. Hopefully we'll see the picture of the chiasm. So almost all modern writing builds towards the climax at the end. That's what we're used to. If you were to watch an action movie, you would expect that the big showdown comes at the end. If you were to watch or read a rom-com, you'd expect that the couple get together at the end. That's where you'd expect the narrative to build towards. A chiasm is different, and lots of ancient writing was written as a chiasm. Hopefully you remember this from a few weeks ago. In a chiasm, the main point is in the middle. So rather than building towards your main point being at the end, the main point is in the middle. That's the point that's being built around, and it's surrounded by matching ideas on either side. And we'll explore, we'll work on the outside, and we'll work our way in through this Psalm 30. In verse 1 and verses 11 and 12, David gives us a quick snapshot of what God's done for him and what David's going to do as a result. What's David going to do? Verse 1 says, I will extol you, O Lord. Basically means I'm going to praise you, I'll exalt you. And verse 12, O Lord my God, I will give thanks to you forever. That's what David's going to do. And what's God done? Well, verse 1 says, you have drawn me up and have not let my foes rejoice over me. And then verse 11 says, you've turned for me my mourning into dancing. You've loosed my sackcloth. You've clothed me with gladness. And for David, those weren't just words or metaphors. That was genuinely his experience. I said a minute ago that it's possible, it's not guaranteed, but it's possible that this psalm was written when David brought the Ark of the Covenant back to Jerusalem. That story is told in 2 Samuel 6. This is what it says, 2 Samuel 6 from verse 12. David went to bring the Ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David, which is Jerusalem, with rejoicing. When those who were carrying the Ark of the Lord had taken 6 steps, he sacrificed a bull and a fattened calf. Wearing a linen ephod, David was dancing before the Lord with all his might, while he and all Israel were bringing up the Ark of the Lord with shouts of joy and with the sounds of the trumpets. I think if you were to ask a Christian what it means to be joyful, often their answer would focus on what's in here, and maybe what's in here. I think that's not wrong. We know joy in our minds, right? We know that, and we experience joy in our hearts. I think both of those things are true. But David shows us that there's more to it than that. Joy leads to celebration. Joy leads to genuinely and intentionally living your life differently because of what's in here and what's in here. David didn't just know joy or experience joy, although he did both of those things. David danced for joy. He lived out his joy. David celebrated. As we move in a section, we'll look at verses 2 and 3, and then 6 and 10. We'll see what it is that caused David to celebrate. David goes into a bit more detail about what's happened to him. He's essentially sharing a testimony of answered prayer. That's what he's doing in the next section. In the same way that we've been doing this afternoon. Again, it's not made clear exactly what happened to David, but something has happened that means that he thinks he's going to die. We don't know exactly what, but he thinks he's going to die. If you look at verse 9, he writes about his death. And the most likely reasons are either that he was ill, he talks in verse 2 about God healing him, or he's under attack. He talks in verse 1 about God not letting his foes rejoice over him. So either he's ill or he's under attack, maybe both, but for some reason he thinks he's going to die. And then God intervenes, either by healing him or saving him from his enemies, and now David is sharing the story. And the interesting thing is that this psalm is written to be a public call to celebration and worship. We'll see that particularly in the middle verses. This psalm was written to be read out in public at the dedication of the temple, whenever that was. The idea that God's faithfulness to David should be a reason for all Israel to celebrate. Same when we share testimonies here. God's faithfulness to one of us should lead us all to rejoicing. I think Tim said that. What God's done for one person, we all rejoice over. That's what's going on here. David shares his testimony, and he calls all of Israel to rejoice. David's particular story starts in verse 6. If you look down at verse 6, this is, I think, the hardest section of the psalm to understand. He says, "In my prosperity, I shall never be moved." What I'm pretty sure he's saying is, things are going well for me. Things are good. Feeling confident. So confident, in fact, I'm not sure I need God. In my prosperity, I thought I had it all sorted. I'd never be moved. He becomes self-sufficient. And from there, things start to go wrong. Whether that's getting ill or coming under attack, he gets confident, self-sufficient, things start to go wrong. Okay, are you ready to learn some economics? I'm an economics teacher, so this is like my thing, I guess. I don't normally get that much enthusiasm. That wasn't much enthusiasm, but that's more than I'm used to, so thank you. This is an economist called Hyman Minsky. He was a professor. He worked in the 1970s, 1980s. His work focused on financial crises and instability of markets, which sounds very boring, but I'll try and make it clear why I'm going with this. BBC News says that his main idea was so simple, it could fit on a T-shirt with just 3 simple words. His main idea was, stability is destabilizing. That was his idea. In 1975, he published his financial instability hypothesis, and it argued that when an economy was stable, when things were going well, banks got more and more confident. And when they did that, they lent money in more and more risky ways to more and more risky people. People borrowed more and more money, and the banks were just like, oh, I'll be fine, they'll pay it back, we'll make more and more profit, and it will go on forever. What Minsky predicted was that eventually they'd reach what will be called, it's an amazing phrase, a Minsky moment. And at the Minsky moment, basically things collapse. Suddenly people who were lent money realize they can't pay it back, the banks run out of money, and the whole system collapses. Stability leads to instability. He published his theory in 1975, and nobody cared. No one was interested. Between then and 2007, he was quoted in The Economist magazine once, and even then it was just a quote in passing. No one cared about what he said. He died in 1996, a relatively obscure economist. No one had really heard of him. Then, in 2007, 2008, the world hit a financial crisis that was one of the biggest in history, in pretty much exactly the way that Minsky had predicted. You might remember, if you're old enough to remember, banks got more and more confident. They lent out more and more money to more and more risky people, and particularly what was called subprime mortgages. Eventually, we reached a Minsky moment. People couldn't pay back. The economy collapsed. And suddenly people were like, didn't someone talk about this in the 1970s? We kind of ignored it. Oh, yeah, and now Minsky is much more popular. Since 2007, he's been quoted in over 30 articles in The Economist. Recently, The Economist put together their 6 seminal papers of economics, 6 key theories you should know. This is one of them. 6 key theories. This is one of them. Now his work is taught in universities across the world. What Minsky put his finger on, and what most people chose to ignore until it's too late, is an idea that's central to the story of the Bible. It's the idea that human beings tend towards self-sufficiency. Leave a human being for any amount of time, things are going well, they'll think they have it sorted. That's exactly what happened to David. He had a Minsky moment. He said, "In my prosperity, I shall never be moved. I've got it sorted." And for David, the reason for his celebration is that he realized that. He realized before it was too late that he believed he had it all sorted on his own. Like all those economists who ignored Minsky's ideas while things were going well, David convinced himself that he was fine on his own. But then when things went wrong, he realized something else. He realized that he didn't need to put his confidence in his own ability. He cries out to God. He talks all the way through his psalm about crying out to God. And God saves him. And now he's calling us to celebrate. And so, David shares his testimony, and as he does, he's building towards the climax of the psalm. These 2 verses, 4 and 5, are like the mountaintop that David has been building us towards. This is the point that the psalm is making. Sing praise to the Lord, O you his saints, and give thanks to his holy name. For his anger is but a moment, and his favor is for a lifetime. Weeping may last for the night, but joy comes in the morning. Here David's saying, this is what God is like. He's proved it in what he's done for me. This is the center of the chiasm. This is what I'm going to do, because this is my story, and my conclusion is this is what God is like. That's what David's been building towards. His anger lasts only for a moment, but his favor lasts a lifetime. And so David calls on the Israelites, and by extension us, to celebrate. That's the call of the psalm, celebrate. And when we talk about celebration, I think there are 2 poor imitations that people often end up settling for when they're aiming for celebration. There's 2 poor imitations where it's easy to fall short. The first is distraction. I don't know if you're still paying for Netflix. People still paying for Netflix? Or like borrowing your parents' account, that kind of thing. I don't know if you're still doing that. But at the end of a Netflix, and it like rolls through all the different shows they produce, and it like describes them in 3 words, like intense, psychological. You know that? Yeah. It makes me realize how much content is produced just to distract us. Like how much of our time is spent consuming TV, scrolling through the news or social media, not out of celebration, just out of distraction. I think as well of how often I hear about parties that sound much more like a distraction than a celebration, much more about forgetting or escaping or avoiding than engaging. Distraction is a poor imitation of celebration. And the second poor imitation is hedonism. And I think this is a big reason why Christians are wary of celebration. I don't want to be hedonistic. I don't want it to be all about me. But they're radically different. The difference is that hedonism is entirely focused inwards on getting what I want. Celebration is focused outwards, both on others and on God. This is how Dallas Willard describes celebration. I think it's really helpful. We engage in celebration when we enjoy ourselves, our lives, and our world in conjunction with our faith and confidence in God's greatness, beauty, and goodness. We concentrate on our life and world as God's work and God's gift to us. It's not distraction. Willard calls it a discipline of engagement. We engage in the world to celebrate. It's not distraction, but it's also not hedonism. Everything we have is God's. We're celebrating Him, not ourselves. It's a beautiful, distinctive way to live. And it's a way of living that is true to the heart of God. This is what John Ortberg writes. We will not understand God until we understand this about Him. God is the happiest being in the universe. God also knows sorrow. Jesus is remembered, amongst other things, as being a man of sorrow. But the sorrow of God, like the anger of God, is a temporary response to a fallen world. That sorrow will be banished forever from His heart on the day that the world is set right. Joy is God's basic character. Joy is his eternal destiny. God is the happiest being in the universe. Most of us find that hard to believe. Both intellectually and experientially, it's hard to believe. But Ortberg is pretty clear. We won't understand God until we understand that. But Jesus, too, had a hard time of helping people understand it. He came to convey a message that people found it very hard to understand. He spent his time eating and drinking, and in the eyes of the religious leaders of the day, he was eating and drinking in the wrong way with the wrong kind of people. And in response, he, in a way that only Jesus can do, which is both gracious and challenging, in response, he told 3 really famous stories. And I'm not sure I can add anything to them, so I'm just going to read them. They're probably stories that you know, probably really familiar to you. As you listen, I'd really encourage you, listen out for the celebrations in these stories. That's the bit we often miss. Listen out for the celebrations. Maybe you've lost sight a little bit of what God is like. Maybe you've never really known what God is like. Listen out in these stories for the rejoicing. It's really there. I'm going to encourage you, if you want to close your eyes. Don't have to, only if you feel comfortable. Nothing weird's going to happen. I'm just going to read. If you want to, you can close your eyes just to help you to listen, particularly because these stories are so familiar. But listen out for the rejoicing. Now, the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners. He eats with them." Then Jesus told them this parable. "Suppose one of you has 100 sheep and loses one of you. Doesn't he leave the 99 in the open country and go after the lost sheep until he finds it? And when he finds it, he joyfully puts it on his shoulders and goes home. Then he calls his friends and neighbors together and says, 'Rejoice with me, I've found my lost sheep.' I tell you, in the same way, there will be more rejoicing in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 persons who do not need to repent. Or suppose a woman has 10 coins and loses one. Doesn't she light a lamp, sweep the house, and search carefully until she finds it? And when she finds it, she calls her friends and neighbors together and says, 'Rejoice with me, I've found my lost coin.' In the same way, I tell you, there is rejoicing in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents." Jesus continued, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate now.' So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there he squandered his wealth on wild living. After he'd spent everything, there was a severe famine in the whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare? And here I am starving to death. I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and he went back to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him and kissed him. The son said to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast. Let's celebrate. For the son of mine was dead, but he's alive again. He was lost, but now he's found. So they began to celebrate. Okay, you can open your eyes now, because there's a picture as well, so you need to open your eyes. These are two of my really good friends. This photo was taken at my wedding. It was wild, it was great, almost 4 years ago, close to 4 years. We got married in a church near here, and we went to a reception venue, and we ate good food. We had wine from Moldova, which is where we met. We played games, there were speeches and laughter and music, dancing, people jumping into each other's arms at various points in the evening as well. And when the Bible talks about heaven, this is how it talks about it. No clouds, it's a party. One giant celebration. This again is John Ortberg. He says, "The joy that's in store for God's people is so great that the only image that can do it justice is the joy between a lover and their beloved. Then we will see the wedding of which the greatest weddings of this earth have been a dim foreshadowing. Then God will dance with his people. Then joy will reign, undiminished and uninterrupted." In this series on the Psalms, we're going to think through the full range of human emotions and experiences, which is a really good thing. It's really wise and emotionally healthy to talk about the highs and the lows of the human experience, of which there are many. Later on this summer, Izu's going to speak on anxiety, Tim's going to speak on depression, Anthony's going to speak on death. But I was really, really keen to start this series teaching on celebration, because those other experiences are all temporary, but celebration is permanent. One day, anxiety and depression and even death will just be memories, but celebration will be our reality. There may be weeping in the night, and if you're in the midst of any of those things, it's really painful, really painful. There may be weeping in the night, but joy comes in the morning. And it will last and last and last. We live, I would say, in one of the most cynical cities, in one of the most cynical countries of a cynical world. Is that fair? I've got no data to back that up, but it just feels true, doesn't it? Like, speak to any Londoner, and it's probably true. Right? Probably your typical Londoner, probably overtired, overworked. Whether they're renting or got a mortgage, they can probably barely afford wherever it is they live. And that's probably way smaller than anywhere else they could choose to live anywhere else in the country. They probably haven't got enough time for their friends or their family or exercise. They're probably pretty cynical. The challenge and the invitation of David's psalm is to resist the cynicism. Last week, I was at a little zoo with Eden. Eden's our daughter. She's 14 months. She hasn't got many words, but one of her favorite words is fish, or ish. She's like, ish, ish. She can't say F, so ish, ish. And I was carrying her through the zoo, and we came around a corner, and what came into view was a fish tank, kind of not massive, like kind of fairly standard fish. And she got really excited. She was pointing like, ish, ish, ish. I was much less excited, if I'm honest. Like, I've seen a lot of fish. They weren't particularly exciting fish. They were kind of not very colorful, quite small. They weren't doing anything fun. Eden was really excited. And the more I think about it, the more I realize that maybe Eden has it right and I have it wrong. This is what G.K. Chesterton writes. It's very poetic, but I think it's really helpful. Because children have abounding vitality, they always say, do it again. And the grown-up person does it again until they're almost dead. For grown-up people are not strong enough to exult in monotony. But perhaps God is strong enough to exult in monotony. It's possible that God says every morning, do it again to the sun. And every evening, do it again to the moon. It may not be automatic necessity that makes all daisies alike, all fish alike. It may be that God makes every daisy separately, every fish separately, and he's never got tired of making them. It may be that he has the eternal appetite of infancy. For we have sinned and grown old, and our Father is younger than we. It's quite kind of dense and poetic, but I think so helpful. What if God has that eternal appetite of infancy, and we've lost it? If I were to hazard a guess, I would guess that your workplace doesn't have a culture that you describe as the eternal appetite of infancy. I guess, probably not. Like if you work for the NHS, I assume people on their tiny lunch breaks in the midst of a really long shift aren't going, aren't we just so lucky to be really helping people? I assume people aren't saying that very often. If you work in a law court, I assume people aren't like, you know what, I just love the justice system, it's so good. I assume people aren't saying that very often. If you work in a school, like I work in a school, I assume that people are more likely to be counting down to the next holiday than celebrating the fact we have free education for all students until they're 18. And there's lots of justified reason for cynicism, particularly if you work in the public sector. We know that things are probably as hard as they've been for a very long time, as stretched as they've been for a very long time. But what if we chose to resist the cynicism? Imagine how different your workplace or your school run or the baby groups that you go to would be if you made an active choice to celebrate rather than criticize. When people ask how it's going, what if you don't start by sighing? Oh, we could start, wouldn't it? What if you just said, like, you know what, I'm good. Like, I'm really good. When was the last time you asked someone, how's it going? And they just went, I'm really good. What if we did that? Not like faking it, like there's room for a range of emotions, as we'll explore throughout this series. But what if when we can, we choose to celebrate rather than be cynical? Celebration is biblical. That was the point today. I hope I've shown you that and convinced you of that. I have been, I'll admit, deliberately vague about what I mean by celebration. And the reason for that is I think that it looks different for each of us. When I read the story of David dancing, I reckon some of you probably thought, you know what, like, our church really needs more of that, like more real, like, expressions of joy. That would be so good if we had more of that kind of thing in church. And probably at the same time, others of you were like, dancing in public is my worst nightmare. I think that's okay. I think it's okay that we have different ways of celebrating and we experience celebration in different ways. The way you celebrate, I think, is left open to you, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it. Richard Foster wrote a famous book called The Celebration of Discipline, and he works through various different spiritual disciplines. And the last chapter is the discipline of celebration. We're free to choose when and how to celebrate, but at the same time, it is a discipline. It requires active thought and planning and effort, sometimes our time and our money to make it happen. But it's worth it. It's worth it. As we finish, we're going to respond in a variety of ways. We're going to respond in worship. I think that's a great chance to celebrate who God is and what he's done for us. Particularly if maybe normally your posture is maybe more reserved in worship, I really encourage you, if you feel comfortable, why not just be a little bit freer? Like, if you feel comfortable, why not raise your hands? Again, you don't have to, but that's a really wonderful way of physically celebrating God, who he is, what he's done for us. We're going to respond in a few minutes in worship. There'll be the chance as well to pray. We're going to have a prayer ministry team over here. A really great chance to spend time praying for anything that's on your mind, but particularly any prayers of thanksgiving. It'd be wonderful to go and pray a prayer of thanksgiving with one of the prayer team. Or maybe you kind of hear this and you're like, you know what, I really struggle to believe that. I really struggle with cynicism. That'd be a great chance to pray and ask God to really help you with that. Or why not just pray with the people around you? Like, you don't, obviously welcome to go and pray with the guys over there, but also if you want to, pray with the people around you. It would be so wonderful if we created a culture where people were really keen to share God's goodness with each other, and we spent time praying prayers of thanksgiving just in the seats around us. That would be wonderful. But the one way that I really want to suggest to you, on top of prayer and worship, is what I think is the way that the Bible talks most about celebration. I think, and I'm open to feedback here, but I think that almost always celebration is with other believers, and it involves food. That tends to be the way, doesn't it? Like, the Israelites observed feasts throughout the year. God taught them to feast at different points, and it was always with other believers, and it was always with food. Think about that wedding celebration of eternity, other believers and food. That's where we're going towards. A couple of weeks ago, we had a growth group social. If you're not in a growth group, now would be a great time to join one, like ready for September. Our group is the best, just to be honest, but there are a range of groups, but ours is the best. It's true. I mean, it is true. But there are other groups, and you're already welcome. We'd love you to join one. But we had a social. We spent time together. We ate together. We had loads of different desserts. People have brought like so many different desserts. So it was like so much choice. It was great. We celebrated. We celebrated the fact it was the summer. We celebrated another year of being a growth group together. We celebrated answered prayers. Even in the last couple of weeks of growth group, God had answered our prayers. It was a discipline, to cook, to show up, to commit to growth group for a year. But it was worth it. It's a discipline, but it's worth it. And so as we finish, I wonder if you would take out your phone for me. Try, see if this works. I wonder if you take out your phone for me. And if you've got a calendar on your phone, you probably have, go to the calendar. Here's my question for you. Is there something that you could commit to celebrating? Doesn't matter what it is, doesn't matter how. Could be a birthday, could be an anniversary coming to faith, wouldn't that be cool? Could be something really small, like a day off or a bank holiday or the sunshine coming back, maybe. Put that in for like October, maybe. Could be with loads of people, could be with a couple of people. It could involve dancing. It doesn't have to involve dancing if you don't want to. You're free to choose, but why don't we choose? I'm just going to give you a minute or so. Why don't you just have a think? Is there just something you can celebrate? I think celebration is biblical, but it's also a discipline. And so I'm just going to give you a minute. Is there anything that you can celebrate? Why don't you commit to it now? Make it happen. So while you're there, Diane, when was the celebration for Rebecca and Yinka? 15th of August. That's a celebration. Rebecca, how many years have you lived in London for? 6 years. I'm sure you have some stories of God's faithfulness. That's a celebration, right? God's people, food, a celebration. If you did put something in your phone, I'm so glad. I think I probably, if I'm honest, would have been too cynical. I probably would have been like, the preacher's asking us to do this weird thing with our phones. I'll just do it later and then I'll never do it. But celebration is biblical, right? It's a discipline, but it's also an invitation to resist cynicism and chase after the heart of God. To that end, we're going to finish by worshiping together. We're going to celebrate. If I invite the band back up. Why don't you stand? I'll pray, and then we'll spend some time in worship.